You find yourself constantly fighting battles you never saw coming, scrambling to respond while your opponent seemed to have planned 3 moves ahead. Every conflict at work or in life feels like you're already losing before you even understand what's happening, while others appear to effortlessly control the outcome from the very beginning. I am Sun Tzu, and I mastered the art of victory in the deadliest arena of all, the battlefield, where being caught unprepared meant death for thousands of men under my command. Through my campaigns, I learned that true victory comes not from fighting harder, but from positioning yourself so skillfully that your opponents defeat themselves before the battle begins. What I discovered about winning before the fighting starts will give you the power to see conflicts coming, position yourself advantageously, and secure victory through preparation rather than confrontation. Whether you're commanding armies or navigating office politics, the principles of preemptive victory remain unchanged across centuries. Take the first step by liking this video, subscribing for more ancient strategic wisdom, and telling me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm curious to see our global community of future strategists grow. The bamboo scrolls before me tell a story that began over 2.5 millennia ago, when I was nothing more than an ambitious young man in the state of Wu, watching armies march to their destruction with predictable regularity. These scrolls, yellowed with age and carefully preserved, contain the revolutionary military philosophies that would change warfare forever, but they began as desperate observations of failure. I was born into an era of constant conflict where the Chinese states warred endlessly against each other, consuming lives and resources in battles that solved nothing. My earliest memories are of watching defeated armies return home, their ranks decimated, their leaders bewildered by defeats they never saw coming. I observed generals who possessed courage, discipline, and superior numbers, yet consistently lost to enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. As a young strategist serving under various commanders, I witnessed firsthand the futility of traditional warfare. I watched brave men charge into obvious traps, saw brilliant tactical maneuvers fail because they were predictable, and observed how armies could be destroyed not by superior force, but by superior thinking. The breakthrough moment came during a campaign where our forces outnumbered the enemy 3-1, yet we suffered a crushing defeat because our opponent had positioned us exactly where he wanted us before the battle began. That night, as I walked among our wounded, I realized that most battles are lost long before the first sword is drawn. The enemy commander had won not through superior fighting, but through superior preparation. He had studied our patterns, understood our weaknesses, and created conditions where our strengths became liabilities. While we prepared for battle, he prepared for victory. This revelation led me to develop what would become my core principle. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. The idea was revolutionary in an age that glorified combat and measured honor by the number of enemies slain. My contemporaries believed that courage and strength determined victory, but I began to understand that intelligence and positioning were far more powerful. I spent years developing this philosophy, studying not just military tactics, but human psychology, politics, and the art of deception. I learned that the mind was the true battlefield, and that controlling information, timing, and positioning could make physical combat unnecessary. When I finally had the opportunity to implement these principles as a commander, the results astonished even me. My first independent campaign involved defending a small territory against a much larger invading force. Instead of meeting them in direct battle, I used strategic positioning, misinformation, and psychological warfare to convince the enemy commander that attacking would be far more costly than he had anticipated. Through careful manipulation of intelligence, I made him believe we were stronger and better positioned than we actually were. The enemy withdrew without a single casualty on either side. This victory through non-fighting became my signature approach. I realized that the ultimate strategic achievement was not to win battles, but to achieve your objectives without needing to fight at all. When combat was unavoidable, I ensured that the outcome was determined by preparation, positioning, and intelligence rather than by chance or courage alone. The principles I recorded on these bamboo scrolls represented a complete departure from traditional military thinking. Where others saw warfare as a test of strength, I saw it as a test of wisdom. Where others prepared for battle, I prepared for victory. This philosophical shift would guide everything I taught and every campaign I conducted, transforming not just my own military career, but the very nature of strategic thinking itself. The bronze mirror in my quarters served a purpose far beyond vanity. It was my most essential strategic tool. Each morning I would hold this polished surface and force myself to confront the most dangerous enemy any commander faces: self-deception. What I discovered through years of brutal self-examination was that most battles are lost not to external enemies, but to the lies we tell ourselves about our own capabilities and limitations. Early in my military career, I witnessed a brilliant general lead his army to destruction because he refused to acknowledge his own weaknesses. He was exceptional at inspiring troops and planning complex maneuvers, but he was impatient and prone to anger when plans didn't unfold perfectly. His enemy recognized these traits and deliberately created situations that would trigger his impatience, leading him to abandon sound strategy for emotional reactions. The general's failure to know himself cost him everything. That lesson taught me that self-knowledge must be ruthless and complete. I developed a systematic approach to cataloging my own strengths and weaknesses, updating this assessment constantly. As I gained experience and faced new challenges, I studied my decision-making patterns under pressure, identified my emotional triggers, and honestly evaluated my capabilities in different types of situations. The process was far from comfortable. I had to acknowledge that despite my strategic mind, I was not naturally charismatic like some commanders. I had to admit that my patience, while usually an asset, could become indecision when rapid action was required. I recognized that my preference for careful planning could blind me to opportunities that required immediate improvisation. But this brutal honesty became my greatest strength. By knowing exactly what I could and couldn't do, I could position myself and my forces to maximize our advantages while minimizing our vulnerabilities. I learned to delegate tasks that didn't suit my temperament to subordinates who excelled in those areas. I developed systems to check my own biases and blind spots. More importantly, I discovered that most people battle themselves long before they ever face external opposition. The executive who knows he struggles with public speaking but takes on roles requiring constant presentations is defeating himself. The entrepreneur who hates detailed financial management but refuses to hire an accountant is fighting a losing battle against her own nature. I created what I called the 4 Mirrors practice, a daily discipline of self-examination that looked at 4 critical areas. The first mirror reflected my emotional state and how it might affect my judgment. The second showed my current capabilities and limitations. The third revealed my biases and assumptions that might cloud my thinking. The fourth displayed my energy levels and motivation, helping me understand when I was operating at peak effectiveness and when I needed to be more cautious. This practice revealed patterns I never would have noticed otherwise. I learned that I made my best strategic decisions in the early morning when my mind was clear, but I was prone to overconfidence after recent victories. I discovered that I was excellent at seeing long-term consequences, but sometimes missed immediate tactical opportunities. I realized that I was most vulnerable to deception when I was tired or under extreme pressure. The mirror taught me that knowing yourself is not a one-time assessment, but an ongoing discipline. As we grow and change, our strengths and weaknesses evolve. The capabilities that served us in one phase of life may become limitations in another. The self-knowledge that guided past victories may need updating for future challenges. In modern terms, this translates to conducting regular career audits, honestly assessing your skills, preferences, energy patterns, and growth areas. It means understanding not just what you're good at, but what drains your energy and what situations bring out your worst tendencies. It requires acknowledging that your greatest strengths, when overused or misapplied, can become your greatest weaknesses. The bronze mirror reminds us that the first victory in any battle is the victory over self-ignorance. Only when you see yourself clearly can you position yourself strategically in the world. The worn ledger containing my spy network records reveals the secret that enabled me to win battles before they started. I knew my enemies better than they knew themselves. This ancient book, filled with careful observations and intelligence. Reports represents years of systematic study of human nature, decision patterns, and the art of understanding what others will do before they do it. Most commanders gathered intelligence about enemy troop numbers, weapons, and positions. Basics, information that any competent scout could provide. But I realized that knowing what your opponent has is far less valuable than knowing how they think. I developed what I called the 5 essential intelligences that every strategist must gather about their opposition. The first intelligence concerned their capabilities, not just their resources, but how effectively they could deploy them. I studied not only how many soldiers an enemy commander had, but how well trained they were, how loyal they remained under pressure, and how quickly they could be moved and repositioned. I learned that a smaller, more disciplined force often possessed greater real capability than a larger, poorly organized army. The second intelligence focused on their intentions and objectives. What did they really want to achieve? What were they willing to sacrifice to get it? I discovered that understanding an opponent's true motivations allowed me to predict their decisions with remarkable accuracy. A commander fighting for personal glory would make different choices than one fighting to protect his homeland. The third intelligence involved their decision-making patterns and psychological tendencies. Did they prefer aggressive action or cautious preparation? How did they respond to pressure, setbacks, or unexpected opportunities? I kept detailed records of how different commanders reacted in various situations, building psychological profiles that allowed me to anticipate their responses to my actions. The fourth intelligence concerned their relationships and alliances. Who did they trust? Who influenced their decisions? What tensions existed within their ranks? I often found that understanding an enemy's internal politics was more valuable than knowing their military strength, because internal conflicts could be exploited to create victory without fighting. The fifth intelligence addressed their information sources and communication methods. How did they gather intelligence about me? What did they believe about my capabilities and intentions? By controlling what information reached them, I could influence their decisions and lead them into strategic traps. Building this intelligence network required patience and significant resources. But the investment paid enormous dividends. I recruited merchants who traveled between territories, servants who worked in enemy households, and even enemy soldiers who could be turned through careful persuasion rather than force. Each source provided pieces of a larger puzzle that revealed not just what my enemies were doing, but why they were doing it and what they would likely do next. One of my most successful campaigns demonstrates the power of superior intelligence. Facing an enemy commander known for his tactical brilliance, I spent months studying his previous battles and decision patterns. I discovered that he had a tendency to become overconfident after initial victories and would pursue retreating enemies aggressively, sometimes leaving his flanks exposed. Using this knowledge, I positioned my forces to appear vulnerable while actually being prepared for his predictable, aggressive pursuit. When he achieved the early success I had deliberately allowed, his overconfidence led him to make exactly the mistake I had anticipated. His aggressive pursuit put his forces in an impossible position, and I achieved total victory with minimal casualties. The modern application of these principles extends far beyond military conflict. In business, understanding your competitors' capabilities, motivations, decision patterns, internal dynamics, and information sources gives you an enormous strategic advantage. In career advancement, knowing how your colleagues, supervisors, and organization make decisions allows you to position yourself effectively. The key insight is that people are remarkably predictable when you understand their underlying patterns. Most individuals have consistent ways of responding to pressure, opportunity, and challenge. By studying these patterns carefully, you can anticipate reactions and position yourself accordingly. My spine network ledger reminds us that information is the ultimate force multiplier. The commander who sees clearly while keeping his own intentions hidden can orchestrate victory like a master chess player who sees 20 moves ahead while his opponent struggles to understand the current position. The strategic map spread across my table, marked with countless battles and annotated with hard-won wisdom, tell the story of warfare's most fundamental truth. Position determines outcome before the first move is made. These hand-drawn charts, depicting terrain that gave my forces natural advantages, represent the cornerstone principle that transformed me from a competent commander into a master strategist. My philosophy of positioning emerged from a painful early defeat where my army, though superior in numbers and equipment, was systematically destroyed because we fought on ground that favored our enemy. I watched helplessly as our advantages became liabilities, our strengths turned into weaknesses, simply because we had allowed our opponent to choose when and where the battle would be fought. That devastating lesson taught me that the supreme skill is not fighting brilliantly, but positioning yourself so that victory becomes inevitable. I began to study terrain not just as a backdrop for battle, but as a participant that could determine the outcome. I learned to see landscapes through strategic eyes, identifying features that could multiply force, provide protection, or create tactical advantages. From this foundation, I developed what I call the 5 elements of strategic positioning that apply to any competitive situation, whether on ancient battlefields or in modern boardrooms. The first element is elevation, securing the high ground both literally and metaphorically. On the battlefield, elevated positions provide visibility, defensive advantages, and psychological superiority. In modern contexts, this translates to gaining superior information, reputation, or strategic perspective that others lack. The executive who understands industry trends before competitors, the professional who builds relationships with decision-makers, the entrepreneur who identifies market needs before they become obvious, all are claiming the high ground. The second element is access, controlling the pathways that matter. I learned to position my forces near critical supply routes, communication lines, and escape paths. Today, this means positioning yourself at the intersection of important information, flows, decision-making processes, or resource distribution. The manager who becomes the go-to person for critical projects, the salesperson who controls access to key accounts, the consultant who manages relationships with influential clients, all understand the power of controlling access. The third element is resources, ensuring you can sustain your position longer than opponents can sustain theirs. I chose battlegrounds near water sources, food supplies, and defensive materials. Modern positioning requires securing sustainable competitive advantages, unique skills that are difficult to replicate, relationships that provide ongoing value, or market positions that become stronger over time rather than weaker. The fourth element is timing, positioning yourself to act when conditions are most favorable. I learned to occupy strategic ground before enemies recognized its value, then wait patiently for the right moment to exploit that advantage. In contemporary terms, this means recognizing opportunities before they become obvious to everyone, then positioning yourself to capitalize when the timing is optimal. The fifth element is flexibility, maintaining positions that offer multiple options while limiting opponents' choices. I preferred terrain that gave my forces several possible courses of action while channeling enemy movements into predictable patterns. Today's strategic positioning requires maintaining multiple pathways to success while constraining competitors' responses. The patience required for proper positioning cannot be overstated. I often spent months maneuvering forces to achieve optimal position before engaging enemies, understanding that premature action would waste all the advantage I had carefully built. Many of my greatest victories appeared effortless to observers, because the real work, the strategic positioning, had been completed long before the battle became visible. One campaign illustrates this principle perfectly. Facing an enemy known for aggressive tactics, I spent 6 months gradually positioning my forces in terrain that would neutralize his mobility advantages, while maximizing my defensive strengths. When he finally attacked, his superior cavalry was useless in the rocky, narrow passages I had chosen, while my infantry held every advantage. The battle was over in hours, but the victory had been achieved through months of patient positioning. In modern applications, this translates to career positioning that puts you in roles where your strengths are maximized and your weaknesses are irrelevant. Market positioning that makes competitors' advantages meaningless while highlighting your unique value. And relationship positioning that creates mutual dependency rather than one-sided benefit. The ancient maps remind us that victory belongs not to those who fight hardest, but to those who position wisest. When you occupy the right ground at the right time with the right resources and the right flexibility, winning becomes not a matter of struggle, but of inevitability. The bronze sundial that guided my campaign planning sits weathered but precise, its shadows marking not just hours, but the critical moments when action transforms from folly into genius. This ancient timepiece taught me warfare's most difficult lesson, that premature action destroys strategic advantage as surely as hesitation squanders opportunity. My understanding of timing began with a humiliating defeat early in my career. I had positioned my forces perfectly, gathered superior intelligence, and prepared an elegant strategy, then ruined everything by attacking 3 days too early. My impatience cost me the element of surprise, allowed the enemy to adjust their positioning, and turned what should have been a decisive victory into a costly stalemate. That painful lesson taught me that strategic timing is not about speed, but about precision. I learned to think of conflicts as having seasons, just like nature's cycles. There are seasons for preparation, seasons for positioning, seasons for action, and seasons for consolidation. The master strategist recognizes which season he occupies and acts accordingly, understanding that each season has its own optimal behaviors and its own dangers. The season of preparation is when intelligence is gathered, resources are accumulated, and capabilities are developed. During this season, visible action often works against you because it reveals your intentions and allows opponents to counter-prepare. I learned to use preparation seasons for building strength quietly, while appearing inactive or even weak to external observers. The season of positioning follows preparation, when you use accumulated resources and intelligence to secure advantageous circumstances. This season requires patience and discipline, because positioning moves are often indirect and their benefits aren't immediately apparent. Many commanders fail here because they cannot resist the urge to take direct action before their position is optimized. The season of action arrives when conditions align to favor decisive movement. I developed specific indicators that told me when this season had arrived, when enemy vulnerabilities were maximized, when my advantages were at their peak, when external circumstances supported bold moves, and when the cost of waiting exceeded the cost of acting. During action seasons, hesitation becomes the enemy because optimal conditions are temporary. The season of consolidation comes after successful action, when gains must be secured and new equilibrium established. This season is often overlooked by commanders intoxicated by victory, leading them to overextend and lose what they had won. I learned to recognize when action season was ending and consolidation season was beginning. My system for reading these seasons relied on multiple indicators that I monitored constantly. Enemy behavior patterns revealed their readiness and vulnerability levels. Resource availability showed when I could sustain action and when I needed to conserve strength. External political and economic conditions indicated when bold moves would be supported or resisted by broader forces beyond my immediate control. One campaign demonstrates the power of perfect timing. Facing a superior enemy force, I spent months in preparation and positioning seasons while they grew impatient and began making mistakes. I watched their discipline erode, their supplies dwindle, and their political support weaken. When multiple indicators aligned, their guards were down, their leadership was divided, weather favored my tactics, and my supply lines were optimized, I struck with overwhelming force. The battle was won not by superior strength, but by superior timing. The discipline of timing requires constantly fighting against natural human impulses. When you're ready to act, external conditions may not be optimal. When conditions are perfect, you may not be prepared. When both align, you may lack the courage to move decisively. Master strategists develop the emotional discipline to wait when waiting serves the strategy and to act boldly when the moment arrives. In modern applications, timing mastery applies to career moves, business launches, negotiations, and relationship decisions. The professional who can read organizational seasons, when leadership is receptive to new ideas, when budgets are being allocated, when political winds favor certain initiatives, gains enormous advantage over those who act according to their own schedules rather than optimal timing. The ancient sundial reminds us that time itself is a strategic resource that can be harnessed by those who understand its rhythms and respect its power. The ancient game pieces scattered across my strategy table tell a tale of warfare's most subtle art, the power of appearing to be what you are not. These faint formation stones, worn smooth by countless training sessions with my officers, represent the principle that gave me victories without bloodshed, the art of making enemies defeat themselves through their own misconceptions. My first lesson in strategic deception came from watching a master chess player defeat opponents not through superior pieces, but by controlling what they believed about the game. He would sacrifice minor pieces to create false impressions, appear vulnerable in one area while building overwhelming strength in another, and guide opponents into making moves that served his strategy rather than their own. I realized that this same principle could revolutionize warfare. The foundation of strategic deception rests on a counterintuitive truth. When you are strong, appear weak. When you are weak, appear strong. This is not mere trickery, but strategic necessity. Strength that is obvious invites direct challenge and forces you to prove your capabilities through costly confrontation. Weakness that is apparent invites attack when you cannot defend effectively. By controlling perceptions, you can fight battles on your terms rather than your enemies. I developed what I called the theater of war, a systematic approach to managing enemy perceptions through carefully orchestrated actions. Like a skilled actor, I learned to project characters that served my strategic objectives: the overconfident commander who underestimated opposition, the cautious leader who could be goaded into premature action, the desperate general who was more vulnerable than he appeared. The art lies in making deceptions believable and sustainable. Poor deception fails because it contradicts too much evidence or requires too many supporting lies. Master-level deception works because it contains enough truth to be credible while misdirecting attention from critical realities. I learned to embed false information within accurate intelligence, to hide genuine preparations within obvious decoy activities, and to use real vulnerabilities to disguise greater strengths. One of my most successful deceptions involved facing an enemy commander, known for his aggressive nature. Rather than try to hide my preparations, I made them highly visible, while ensuring they suggested a defensive strategy. I positioned troops in defensive formations, stockpiled supplies as if preparing for a siege, and sent messages discussing how long we could hold our positions. Meanwhile, I secretly prepared a mobile strike force that could exploit his inevitable, aggressive assault. When he attacked our apparently defensive positions, he committed his forces in exactly the pattern I had anticipated. At the crucial moment, my hidden strike force emerged to attack his exposed flanks while our defensive troops transformed into an offensive spearhead. His own aggression became the weapon that destroyed his army. The ethics of strategic deception require careful consideration. I never lied to my own people or broke faith with allies, but I felt no obligation to reveal my true intentions to enemies who sought to destroy me. The deception was not about creating false promises or betraying trust, but about maintaining operational security and using enemy assumptions against them. In modern contexts, this translates to strategic communication that emphasizes certain truths while de-emphasizing others. The negotiator who appears more flexible than she actually is, the entrepreneur who seems less prepared than he truly is, the professional who projects confidence in areas where opponents expect uncertainty, all are using strategic perception management. The key is understanding what your opponents expect to see and then carefully crafting reality to meet those expectations while serving your actual objectives. This requires deep insight into human psychology and the patience to maintain consistent personas over extended periods. However, deception must never become self-deception. I maintained clear internal awareness of true capabilities and circumstances while projecting different impressions externally. The commander who begins believing his own deceptions will make strategic errors based on false assumptions about his own position. My faint formation stones remind us that perception often matters more than reality in determining outcomes. The strategist who can control what others believe about the situation can often achieve objectives without needing to prove superior strength through direct confrontation. In a world where information flows rapidly and first impressions matter enormously, the ability to shape perceptions ethically and effectively becomes a crucial competitive advantage. The ultimate goal is not to lie, but to maintain the initiative. By ensuring that opponents make decisions based on incomplete or misdirected understanding of your true capabilities and intentions. The silk banner that flew above my fastest cavalry units bears the symbol of lightning, not for its destructive power, but for its decisive speed. This lightning strike formation banner represents my discovery that velocity, when properly applied, multiplies force far beyond what numbers or strength alone can achieve. I learned that in warfare, as in life, timing combined with speed creates momentum that can overwhelm even superior opposition. My understanding of speed as a strategic weapon began with observing nature itself. Lightning doesn't gradually build to its full power. It strikes with immediate, overwhelming force that paralyzes opposition before resistance can be organized. Water doesn't slowly erode rock through gentle pressure. It cuts through stone when focused into a powerful, fast-moving stream. I realized that human conflicts followed similar principles. The key insight was distinguishing between haste and speed. Haste is frantic action without proper preparation. It leads to mistakes, wasted energy, and strategic failure. Speed is decisive action after thorough preparation. It concentrates maximum force at the optimal moment and location. The difference between these two concepts determines whether rapid action leads to victory or disaster. I developed what I called the lightning doctrine: prepare slowly, strike swiftly. This meant investing extensive time in intelligence gathering, positioning and resource allocation, then executing with such speed that enemies had no opportunity to respond effectively. The preparation phase was deliberate and methodical, but once conditions were optimal, action became explosive and overwhelming. Speed serves multiple strategic functions simultaneously. It denies enemies time to prepare adequate defenses, prevents them from calling for reinforcements, creates psychological shock that disrupts their decision-making, and maintains the initiative throughout the engagement. When you move faster than opponents can process and respond, you essentially fight against their past position rather than their current one. One campaign illustrates this principle perfectly. After months of careful positioning, I learned that an enemy commander would be traveling with a small escort through territory where I could intercept him. Rather than engage his main army in prolonged warfare, I organized a lightning strike that captured their leadership in a single swift action. The entire enemy force surrendered within days because their command structure had been eliminated before they could organize resistance. The psychological impact of speed often exceeds its tactical advantages. Enemies who face overwhelming velocity begin to expect defeat and make decisions based on fear rather than strategy. They become reactive instead of proactive, constantly responding to your initiatives rather than pursuing their own objectives. This psychological momentum can be more valuable than physical advantages. However, speed must be sustainable to be strategically useful. I learned to calculate not just how fast my forces could move initially, but how long they could maintain that pace and what resources were required to sustain rapid operations. Unsustainable speed exhausts your forces and leaves you vulnerable to counterattack once momentum is lost. Building momentum requires understanding that initial movement often feels slow and difficult, but persistence creates acceleration that becomes increasingly powerful. Like pushing a massive stone up a hill, the beginning requires enormous effort for small progress, but once the stone crests the hill, gravity multiplies your force dramatically. In modern applications, this translates to professional projects that build slowly but launch decisively, business strategies that prepare thoroughly, then execute rapidly, and career moves that involve extensive preparation, followed by bold, swift action. The entrepreneur who spends months researching markets then launches with overwhelming speed. The professional who quietly builds capabilities then rapidly demonstrates value. The organization that pilots programs carefully then scales with decisive velocity. All understand the lightning doctrine. The critical skill is recognizing when preparation phase should end and execution phase should begin. Too little preparation leads to hasty mistakes. Too much preparation allows opportunities to pass and competitors to catch up. Master strategists develop intuition for the optimal transition point where speed becomes your greatest advantage. My lightning banner reminds us that in a world where conditions change rapidly and opportunities are temporary, the ability to move from preparation to action with decisive speed often determines who succeeds and who merely tries. The jade seal that marked my authority as Supreme Commander represents more than mere rank. It embodies the principle that divided leadership guarantees defeat before battle begins. This general's seal of authority, carved with symbols of unified. Command taught me that even the most brilliant strategy fails when execution lacks clarity, consistency, and coordinated purpose. My first encounter with the deadly consequences of divided command came when serving under a coalition of allied generals. Each commander possessed individual brilliance, experience, and tactical skill, yet our combined force suffered a catastrophic defeat against a smaller, less experienced enemy. The reason was simple. We had 5 different strategies, 3 conflicting chains of command, and no unified vision of victory. Our enemy, led by a single decisive commander, defeated us piece by piece, while we argued about objectives and authority. That humiliating lesson revealed a fundamental truth. Organizational strength multiplies when unified and divides when conflicted. 10 men moving in perfect coordination can defeat 20 men moving at cross purposes. A smaller force with absolute clarity of command will consistently outperform a larger force with confused leadership structure. I learned to establish what I called the 4 pillars of command unity, each essential for coordinated action and strategic success. The first pillar is clarity of authority. Everyone must know exactly who makes final decisions and whose orders take precedence when conflicts arise. Ambiguous authority creates hesitation, political maneuvering, and delayed action at precisely the moments when speed and decisiveness matter most. The second pillar is consistency of vision. All leaders must understand and commit to the same. Definition of victory. I observed that conflicting objectives destroy coordination even when authority is clear. Commanders pursuing different goals will make decisions that undermine each other, creating internal competition that benefits only external enemies. The third pillar is alignment of methods. Not only must everyone agree on the destination, but they must understand the path for reaching it. I learned to ensure that all subordinate leaders understood both the overall strategy and their specific role in implementing it. When methods conflict, even shared objectives become impossible to achieve. The fourth pillar is accountability for results, clear consequences for success and failure that reinforce unified action. I established systems that rewarded behaviors supporting overall strategy while discouraging actions that served individual interests at the expense of collective goals. Implementing these pillars required constant attention to organizational dynamics. I spent significant time ensuring that my commanders understood not just their individual responsibilities, but how their actions affected others and contributed to overall success. I created communication systems that kept everyone informed of changing conditions and strategic adjustments. One campaign demonstrated the power of perfect unity of command. Facing an enemy coalition with superior numbers, I recognized that their multiple commanders would struggle to coordinate effectively. While they debated strategy and authority, I launched a series of rapid coordinated strikes that forced them to respond faster than their divided leadership could manage. Their individual commanders made reasonable decisions that collectively created strategic disaster, while my unified force operated like a single organism with multiple limbs. The psychological dimension of command unity extends beyond mere coordination. When people believe in unified leadership and shared purpose, they contribute discretionary effort that formal authority cannot command. They make decisions that serve collective interests even when individual benefit isn't obvious. They maintain commitment during difficult periods because they trust the overall direction and their role within it. However, unity of command must not become rigidity of thinking. I learned to create systems that encouraged input from all levels, while maintaining clear decision-making authority. The best strategies often emerged from combining insights from multiple perspectives, but implementation required single-minded execution under unified leadership. In modern applications, this principle applies to project management, organizational leadership, family decisions, and personal goal setting. The executive who creates clear authority structures while fostering collaborative input, the project manager who ensures all team members understand both their roles and the overall objective, the individual who aligns personal goals with consistent methods and accountability. All understand that divided effort produces divided results. My Jade Seal reminds us that in any competitive endeavor, internal unity becomes external strength, while internal division becomes external vulnerability, regardless of individual capabilities or available resources. The ancient abacus that guided my resource calculations bears the wear of countless strategic decisions, each bead representing the principle that transformed my understanding of victory. The best victories require the least expenditure. This resource allocation abacus taught me that true strategic mastery lies not in overwhelming force, but in achieving maximum impact with minimum waste, a lesson that separates wise commanders from merely brave ones. My education in the economy of force began with a painful realization early in my career. After winning a series of costly battles against inferior opponents, I found my army weakened, my treasury depleted, and my political support eroding despite military success. I had been measuring victory by immediate tactical outcomes rather than long-term strategic position. That experience taught me that wasteful victories are actually disguised defeats. I learned to think of every resource, men, money, time, political, capital, and energy, as finite assets that must generate maximum return on investment. This meant calculating not just the cost of winning, but the cost of winning in different ways, and choosing methods that preserved resources for future challenges rather than consuming them for immediate gratification. The principle extends beyond mere resource conservation to encompass strategic efficiency. I developed what I called the leverage doctrine. Identify the minimum input that can produce maximum output, then apply force at precisely those points where small actions create large consequences, like an engineer who moves massive weights. With properly positioned levers, the strategic master achieves seemingly impossible results through superior positioning rather than superior strength. One campaign illustrates this principle perfectly. Facing an enemy with vast superiority in numbers and resources, I avoided direct confrontation and instead focused on disrupting their supply lines. By attacking a few critical supply convoys with small mobile forces, I created logistical chaos that eventually forced their massive army to withdraw without ever engaging my main force. The enemy's strength became their weakness when they could not sustain their numerical advantage. This approach required completely reimagining how to measure success. Instead of counting enemy casualties or territory conquered, I began evaluating the ratio between resources invested and strategic objectives achieved. A victory that cost me half my army was inferior to a withdrawal that preserved my forces for a more advantageous engagement, even if the withdrawal appeared less glorious. Learn to identify what I called force multipliers, strategic elements that amplified the effectiveness of every other resource. Superior intelligence multiplied the impact of smaller armies by allowing precise targeting of enemy vulnerabilities. Strategic positioning multiplied defensive capabilities by making natural terrain fight alongside my soldiers. Psychological warfare multiplied fear throughout enemy ranks, making small demonstrations of power appear larger than they were. The discipline of resource efficiency also revealed the importance of sustainability over intensity. Many commanders could achieve short-term success through unsustainable resource expenditure, but strategic mastery required building advantages that became stronger over time rather than weaker. I preferred methods that improved my position while weakening opponents, creating compound advantages that grew without additional investment. Time management became another critical dimension of force economy. I realized that my personal attention and decision-making energy were among my most valuable and limited resources. I learned to delegate tactical decisions while reserving strategic choices for myself, to standardize routine processes while customizing critical interventions, and to invest time in preparation that multiplied the effectiveness of execution time. The psychological aspect of resource efficiency created additional advantages. Enemies who saw me achieving significant results with apparently minimal effort began to overestimate my capabilities and underestimate their own chances of success. This reputation for efficiency became its own strategic asset, often convincing opponents to avoid confrontation entirely. In modern applications, this principle transforms how we approach career development, business strategy, and personal productivity. The professional who identifies the 20% of activities that generate 80% of career advancement. The entrepreneur who finds minimum viable products that test maximum market assumptions. The individual who focuses energy on high-leverage personal development. All understand that efficiency creates sustainability and competitive advantage. My ancient abacus reminds us that in a world of infinite opportunities and finite resources, victory belongs not to those who can do everything, but to those who can identify the few things that matter most and execute them with maximum efficiency. The collection of smooth river stones on my desk tells the story of water's greatest lesson. The soft overcomes the hard through adaptability and persistence. These stones, worn to perfect curves by countless years of flowing water, represent my discovery that rigid strategies guarantee failure, while flexible adaptation creates enduring victory. My first lesson in strategic adaptability came through a humiliating defeat where my carefully crafted battle plan crumbled within hours of engagement. The enemy had changed their positioning overnight, weather conditions altered the battlefield dynamics, and my own intelligence proved partially incorrect. Yet I stubbornly adhered to my original strategy, trying to force reality to match my plan rather than adapting my approach to actual conditions. The result was disaster. That painful experience taught me that the map is not the territory, and no strategy survives contact with dynamic reality unchanged. I began studying water, how it always finds a way forward regardless of obstacles, how it adapts its shape to any container while maintaining its essential nature, how it can be gentle enough to nourish life or powerful enough to carve through mountains depending on circumstances. From water, I learned the 5 principles of strategic adaptability that would guide my campaigns for decades. The first principle is maintaining core objectives while adjusting methods. Like water that always flows toward the sea regardless of the path it takes, successful strategies keep sight of fundamental goals while remaining flexible about how to achieve them. The second principle is reading and responding to changing conditions faster than opponents can. Water immediately adjusts to new terrain, obstacles, or channels. Strategic masters develop sensitivity to environmental changes and the ability to modify their approach before competitors recognize the need for adjustment. The third principle is using opponent resistance to create new opportunities. Water doesn't fight against rocks. It flows around them, often creating new channels that provide better paths forward. I learned to view enemy resistance not as obstacles to overcome through force, but as information about where alternative approaches might prove more effective. The fourth principle is maintaining multiple options simultaneously. Water explores every possible path downhill, eventually choosing the route that offers least resistance and greatest flow. I began developing contingency plans and maintaining strategic flexibility that allowed rapid shifts between different approaches as conditions evolved. The fifth principle is patience combined with persistence. Water doesn't hurry, yet it accomplishes everything. It can take centuries to carve through solid rock, but the eventual result is inevitable. I learned to combine long-term persistence toward objectives with short-term adaptability in methods. One campaign demonstrates these principles working together. Facing an enemy in strongly fortified positions, my initial plan called for direct assault. However, when reconnaissance revealed stronger defenses than expected, I adapted immediately. Instead of attacking their strength, I began a campaign of maneuver that forced them to leave their fortifications to protect their supply lines. When they adapted by securing new supply routes, I adapted again by threatening their political alliances. Each adaptation created new opportunities while maintaining pressure toward my ultimate objective. The psychological dimension of adaptability proved equally important. Commanders who could adjust their strategies fluidly while maintaining confidence and purpose inspired similar flexibility in their subordinates. Rigid leaders created rigid organizations that shattered when stressed, while adaptive leaders created resilient forces that grew stronger through challenge. However, Adaptability must be balanced with consistency. Too much flexibility can become directionless wandering, while too little becomes brittle rigidity. I learned to identify which elements of strategy were essential and unchangeable, the core values, fundamental objectives, and key principles, and which elements should remain fluid and responsive to circumstances. The speed of adaptation often determines strategic success. In rapidly changing environments, the organization or individual who can adjust most quickly gains enormous advantage. I developed decision-making processes that enabled rapid strategy modification without losing strategic coherence or organizational confidence. In modern applications, this principle applies to career management in changing industries, business, strategy in dynamic markets, and personal relationships in evolving circumstances. The professional who maintains career objectives while adapting methods to new technologies. The entrepreneur who adjusts business models while preserving core value propositions. The individual who adapts communication styles while maintaining authentic values. All understand that flexibility creates strength. My Riverstones remind us that in a world of constant change, survival and success belong not to the rigid, but to those who can flow like water while maintaining their essential nature and direction. The bronze meditation bell that guided my mental training exercises still resonates with the truth that transformed my understanding of warfare. Battles are won or lost in the mind long before physical engagement begins. This Mind Warrior's meditation bell represents my discovery that psychological mastery, both of oneself and one's opponents, constitutes the ultimate battlefield where all other victories are determined. My awakening to the psychological dimension came during a campaign where I faced an enemy commander with superior numbers, better equipment, and stronger defensive positions. By all conventional measures, I was destined for defeat. Yet I achieved total victory without a single major battle, using only psychological pressure that convinced the enemy their position was hopeless. That campaign taught me that controlling minds was infinitely more powerful than controlling territory. I began developing what I called the inner fortress, a system of mental disciplines that created unshakable psychological strength regardless of external circumstances. Like a physical fortress with multiple defensive layers, the inner fortress protected against fear, doubt, anger, and overconfidence that could corrupt strategic judgment. The first layer of the inner fortress was self-awareness and emotional regulation. I learned to recognize my own psychological states and their impact on decision-making. Fear made me overly cautious and caused me to miss opportunities. Anger made me impulsive and led to strategic mistakes. Overconfidence after victories made me careless in preparation. By monitoring these states constantly, I could make decisions based on strategic reality rather than emotional reactions. The second layer was stress inoculation and mental resilience. I deliberately exposed myself to increasingly challenging situations to build psychological tolerance for pressure. Through meditation, physical conditioning, and simulated crisis exercises, I developed the ability to think clearly and act decisively even under extreme stress. This mental training proved as valuable as tactical knowledge in determining battlefield outcomes. The third layer involved understanding and manipulating enemy psychology. I studied how different personality types responded to various pressures, how to identify psychological vulnerabilities, and how to create conditions that would trigger predictable emotional responses in opponents. A commander prone to anger could be baited into rash decisions. A cautious leader could be paralyzed through uncertainty. An ambitious general could be trapped through appeals to his pride. One campaign illustrates the power of psychological warfare perfectly. Facing an enemy known for his methodical defensive approach, I launched a series of apparently random small-scale attacks that served no obvious tactical purpose. These actions created confusion and uncertainty about my true intentions. As the enemy commander became increasingly frustrated, Trying to understand my strategy, he began making uncharacteristic, aggressive moves to regain initiative. These departures from his natural defensive strengths created the vulnerabilities I exploited. For decisive victory, I discovered that morale and confidence were force multipliers more powerful than superior numbers or equipment. Troops who believed in victory fought with effectiveness that far exceeded their training or resources. Conversely, demoralized forces collapsed even when they possessed overwhelming advantages. Much of my strategic effort focused on building unshakable confidence in my own forces while systematically undermining enemy morale. The techniques for building morale went beyond inspiration and encouragement. I ensured that my soldiers understood not just what they were fighting for, but why victory was inevitable given our preparation and strategy. I shared intelligence that demonstrated enemy weaknesses while highlighting our advantages. I created a culture where each soldier felt personally important to overall success rather than merely expendable. Simultaneously, I worked to create doubt, confusion, and fear in enemy ranks. This wasn't about terrorizing innocents, but about convincing opposing forces that resistance was futile and costly. Sometimes a reputation for invincibility achieved more than actual invincibility because enemies defeated themselves through their own fears rather than requiring defeat through battle. The most sophisticated psychological operations involved creating cognitive dissonance in enemy leadership. By presenting them with information that contradicted their assumptions and expectations, I could create decision paralysis at critical moments. Leaders who couldn't trust their own judgment made erratic choices that served my strategy rather than theirs. However, psychological warfare required absolute honesty with myself about reality. The commander who believes his own propaganda makes strategic errors based on false assumptions. I maintained clear internal assessment of actual capabilities and circumstances while projecting different impressions externally. In modern applications, psychological mastery applies to negotiations, leadership, sales, and personal development. The professional who can maintain composure under pressure while reading others' emotional states accurately. The entrepreneur who can project confidence while managing internal doubts constructively. The individual who can influence others' perceptions while maintaining clear self-awareness all understand that the mind is the ultimate competitive battlefield. My meditation bell reminds us that in any competitive endeavor, victory belongs not necessarily to the strongest or smartest, but to those who can master their own psychology while understanding and influencing the psychology of others. The collection of treaty scrolls that documented my diplomatic victories tells a story more powerful than any battlefield triumph. The supreme achievement is turning potential enemies into valuable allies. These ancient agreements, sealed with jade and bound with silk, represent my discovery that the best victories come not through conquest, but through creating circumstances where others choose to support your success. My education in diplomatic strategy began with observing a master negotiator who resolved a three-way territorial dispute without a single battle. While the competing armies prepared for devastating warfare, he crafted agreements that gave each party something they valued more than the contested territory. The potential enemies became trading partners, and the region prospered through cooperation rather than being devastated by conflict. That lesson taught me that superior diplomacy achieves objectives that superior force cannot. I learned to think of every relationship as a potential strategic asset. Even enemies possessed capabilities, resources, or information that could serve mutual interests under the right circumstances. The art lay in identifying those circumstances and creating conditions where former opponents found greater advantage in alliance than in continued hostility. The foundation of successful alliance. Building rests on understanding what each party truly wants versus what they claim to want. Surface positions often mask deeper interests that can be satisfied through creative arrangements. The neighboring state that demanded territory might actually want security or access to trade routes. The rival commander, who sought military glory, might be satisfied with face-saving recognition of his strategic brilliance. By addressing underlying needs rather than stated demands, I could often transform zero-sum competitions into mutually beneficial partnerships. I developed what I called the 5 pillars of diplomatic victory, each essential for building lasting alliances that served strategic objectives. The first pillar was reciprocal benefit, ensuring that alliance brought genuine value to all parties rather than merely serving my immediate interests. One-sided arrangements created resentment and instability that eventually worked against long-term objectives. The second pillar was credible commitment, demonstrating through actions rather than words that I would honor agreements even when circumstances changed. Reputation for reliability became my most valuable diplomatic asset, making future negotiations easier and attracting allies who valued trustworthy partners. The third pillar was graduated engagement, building relationships through increasingly important cooperative ventures that created momentum toward deeper alliance. Starting with small, low-risk collaborations allowed potential partners to develop confidence in the relationship before committing to major strategic partnerships. The fourth pillar was strategic patience, understanding that the most valuable alliances often required years to develop properly. Rushing diplomatic processes for immediate tactical advantage often sacrificed long-term strategic relationships that could provide much greater future value. The fifth pillar was honorable exit strategies, ensuring that even if alliances ended, they concluded in ways that preserved respect and left open possibilities for future cooperation. Former allies who felt betrayed became implacable enemies, while those who parted honorably often became allies again when circumstances changed. One diplomatic campaign demonstrates these principles working together. Facing a powerful enemy coalition, I identified tensions within their alliance and began separate negotiations with individual members. Rather than trying to bribe them away from their existing commitments, I offered future arrangements that would serve their interests better than their current alliance once the immediate conflict ended. Over months of patient negotiation, I gradually created more attractive alternatives to their existing partnerships. When the crisis peaked, 2 key members of the enemy coalition chose neutrality rather than active opposition, transforming an impossible military situation into a manageable one. The psychological dimension of diplomacy proved as important as material benefits. People wanted to feel respected, understood, and valued as partners rather than merely used as tools. I learned to invest genuine interest in understanding others' perspectives, cultures, and concerns. This authentic curiosity often revealed opportunities for cooperation that purely transactional approaches missed. However, diplomatic victory required maintaining strength while pursuing alliance. Negotiations from weakness rarely produced favorable terms, while negotiations from strength could create partnerships based on mutual respect rather than coercion. I learned to demonstrate capability while emphasizing preference for cooperation over confrontation. The most sophisticated diplomatic operations involved creating alliance networks that served multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. A trade agreement might also provide intelligence access, while a military cooperation pact could create political influence. The best diplomatic arrangements achieved several purposes through single relationships, multiplying their strategic value. Modern applications. This principle transforms how we approach business partnerships, professional relationships, and personal networks. The entrepreneur who creates genuine value for partners while advancing business objectives. The professional who builds alliances that serve mutual career interests. The individual who develops relationships based on authentic, mutual benefit. All understand that sustainable success comes through cooperation rather than competition alone. My treaty scrolls remind us that in an interconnected world, the ability to transform competitors into collaborators often determines who achieves lasting success versus temporary advantage. The battlefield sketches that map my tactical withdrawals tell a counterintuitive truth that separates master strategists from mere fighters. Knowing when not to engage is as crucial as knowing how to win. These ancient maps, marked with retreat, routes that led to ultimate victory, represent my discovery that apparent weakness can become overwhelming strength when properly orchestrated. My understanding of strategic retreat began with a humiliating lesson early in my career. Facing superior enemy forces, I chose to fight rather than withdraw because I feared that retreat would damage my reputation and morale. The resulting defeat was far more costly than any withdrawal could have been, teaching me that ego-driven decisions destroy strategic advantage more surely than enemy action. That painful experience led me to study the true nature of strategic withdrawal. I learned to distinguish between cowardly flight, which abandons strategic objectives due to fear, and strategic retreat, which temporarily abandons tactical positions to achieve superior strategic positioning. The difference lies not in the action itself, but in the purpose and planning behind it. I developed what I called the doctrine of elastic defense, based on the principle that bending without breaking often proves stronger than rigid resistance. Like a tree that survives storms by yielding to wind while maintaining deep roots, strategic retreat allows you to preserve essential capabilities while avoiding unnecessary damage from temporarily superior forces. The first element of strategic retreat is recognizing when current conditions do not favor victory. This requires brutal honesty about relative capabilities, positioning, timing, and circumstances. Many commanders fail here because they cannot admit tactical disadvantage or because they confuse temporary setbacks with permanent defeat. I learned to evaluate situations objectively, understanding that unfavorable conditions today do not determine tomorrow's possibilities. The second element is maintaining strategic initiative, even while withdrawing tactically. True strategic retreat is not passive but active. You control the terms of disengagement while creating conditions for future advantage. I learned to use withdrawal as a weapon that could lure enemies into overextension, expose their weaknesses, or force them to operate in terrain that favored my eventual counterattack. One campaign illustrates this principle perfectly. Facing an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority, I began what appeared to be a desperate retreat. However, each withdrawal was carefully planned to draw them deeper into territory where their supply lines became extended and their numerical advantage became a logistical liability. When they had pursued me far enough to become vulnerable, I turned and attacked with devastating effectiveness. Their strength became their weakness through strategic retreat that transformed the entire strategic situation. The psychological dimension of strategic retreat requires exceptional mental discipline. Withdrawal often appears like failure to external observers and can demoralize your own forces if not properly managed. I learned to communicate the strategic purpose of retreat to key subordinates while maintaining operational security. My forces needed to understand that temporary withdrawal served ultimate victory rather than representing defeat. The timing of strategic retreat is as critical as the decision itself. Too early, and you abandon positions that could have been held successfully. Too late, and retreat becomes costly route rather than strategic repositioning. I developed indicators that signaled optimal withdrawal timing, when enemy advantage was temporary rather than permanent, when retreat could create better future positioning, and when current engagement cost exceeded potential benefits. The most sophisticated applications of strategic retreat involved using apparent weakness to manipulate enemy behavior. By appearing more vulnerable than I actually was, I could encourage aggressive enemy actions that created the very opportunities I needed for counterattack. The enemy's perception of my weakness became the foundation of their strategic mistakes. However, strategic retreat must always serve larger strategic objectives. Withdrawal without purpose becomes aimless wandering that gradually weakens your position until retreat becomes impossible. I learned to ensure that every tactical withdrawal moved me closer to strategic objectives rather than further from them. The courage required for strategic retreat often exceeds that needed for direct confrontation. Fighting requires only immediate bravery, while strategic withdrawal demands long-term confidence in ultimate victory despite temporary appearances of weakness. Many potentially great commanders fail because they lack the courage to appear weak when strength would serve their enemies' interests better than their own. In modern applications, this principle applies to career decisions, business strategy, and personal relationships. The professional who temporarily accepts a lower position to gain valuable experience. The entrepreneur who retreats from unprofitable markets to focus resources on better opportunities. The individual who withdraws from unwinnable arguments to preserve relationships. All understand that strategic retreat serves advancement rather than representing defeat. My withdrawal maps remind us that in a world of limited resources and changing circumstances, the wisdom to retreat when retreat serves victory often determines long-term success more than the courage to fight when fighting serves only pride. The cipher wheels and coded scrolls that protected my strategic communications reveal warfare's most subtle weapon, the power to control what others know, believe, and decide. This collection of encryption methods and strategic messaging tools taught me that information itself becomes the battlefield where victories are won before armies ever meet. My education in information warfare began when enemy spies intercepted my battle plans, leading to a devastating ambush that cost me half my force. That painful lesson taught me that unprotected information becomes a weapon in enemy hands, while controlled information becomes a tool for manipulating their decisions. I realized that every piece of intelligence had strategic value that could work for me or against me, depending on how carefully I managed its flow. I developed what I called the 3 layers of information warfare, each essential for controlling the strategic narrative and maintaining decision-making advantage. The first layer was information security, protecting critical intelligence from enemy discovery while gathering theirs. This required sophisticated encryption methods, secure communication networks, and careful operational security that revealed nothing about my true intentions or capabilities. The cipher system I created used multiple levels of encoding that appeared to be routine communications about supplies, troop movements, or administrative matters. Even if intercepted, these messages revealed false information that served my strategic deception, while the real intelligence traveled through entirely separate channels. My commanders learned to communicate in ways that protected genuine secrets, while creating impressions I wanted enemies to develop. The second layer was strategic messaging, crafting communications that influenced how various audiences interpreted events and made decisions. I learned that the same action could be perceived as strength or weakness depending on how it was presented and contextualized. By controlling the narrative around my activities, I could shape how enemies, allies, and neutral parties responded to changing circumstances. One campaign demonstrates this principle powerfully. After a tactical setback that could have been interpreted as defeat, I immediately disseminated information emphasizing how the engagement had achieved my true objective of drawing enemy forces away from their stronghold. This reframing transformed apparent weakness into evidence of strategic brilliance, maintaining morale among my forces while creating doubt among enemies about their own success. The third layer involved disinformation and misdirection, actively spreading false intelligence that caused enemies to make decisions serving my interests rather than theirs. This required understanding their decision-making processes well enough to predict how they would respond to specific types of information. By feeding them intelligence that confirmed their existing assumptions while leading them toward strategic mistakes, I could manipulate their choices without them realizing they were being influenced. The most sophisticated disinformation campaigns involved multiple false narratives that appeared to contradict each other, creating confusion about my true intentions while all paths led enemies toward the same strategic trap. By giving them too much conflicting information to process accurately, I could paralyze their decision-making at critical moments. However, information warfare required absolute internal clarity about truth versus perception. The commander who believes his own propaganda makes strategic errors based on false assumptions about reality. I maintained rigorous separation between external messaging designed to influence others and internal assessment based on accurate intelligence about actual conditions. The speed of information flow became increasingly important as communication methods improved. Intelligence that arrived too late to influence decisions had no strategic value, while timely information could transform apparently hopeless situations into opportunities for victory. I developed communication systems that prioritized speed without sacrificing security or accuracy. The psychological dimension of information warfare proved as important as its tactical applications. People make decisions based on what they believe to be true rather than what is actually true. By understanding how different audiences processed information and what sources they trusted, I could influence their beliefs and therefore their actions without needing to change underlying realities. Reputation management became a critical component of information strategy. My reputation for strategic brilliance often accomplished more than actual strategic brilliance because enemies made decisions based on what they expected me to do rather than what I was actually planning. This reputation became self-reinforcing as successful campaigns enhanced credibility for future information operations. The ethical dimensions of information warfare required careful consideration. While I felt no obligation to reveal true intentions to enemies seeking my destruction, I never broke faith with allies or spread information that would cause unnecessary suffering to innocents. The goal was strategic advantage through superior information management, not harm for its own sake. In modern applications, information warfare principles apply to reputation management, competitive intelligence, strategic communication, and personal branding. The professional who manages information flow to create favorable impressions while protecting sensitive details. The entrepreneur who shapes market perceptions while maintaining operational security. The individual who controls personal narrative while staying grounded in reality. All understand that information itself has become a primary competitive battlefield. My cipher collection reminds us that in an information-rich world, the ability to protect crucial intelligence while influencing others' perceptions often determines success more than traditional measures of strength or capability. The stone tablets inscribed with moral codes that guided my leadership rest beside my strategy scrolls, reminding me that ethical authority multiplies strategic effectiveness beyond what mere tactics can achieve. These virtue stone tablets represent my discovery that moral foundation doesn't constrain strategic success. It creates the sustainable power that transforms temporary victories into lasting influence. My understanding of strategy's moral dimension began with observing two commanders of equal tactical skill achieve vastly different results. The first relied purely on cunning and force, achieving impressive short-term victories that ultimately collapsed when his methods created more enemies than allies. The second grounded his strategy in principles that others respected, building loyalty and support that multiplied his capabilities far beyond his immediate resources. This contrast taught me that moral authority becomes a strategic asset, more valuable than superior numbers or equipment. I learned that righteous causes attract stronger support because people contribute discretionary effort to leaders they believe serve worthy objectives. When soldiers, allies, and supporters trust that your victory serves something greater than personal ambition, they invest energy and creativity that formal authority cannot command. Conversely, strategies based purely on self-interest create skepticism and resistance that undermine even the most brilliant tactical plans. The foundation of moral strategy rests on what I call the three pillars of righteous leadership. The first pillar is justice in purpose, ensuring that strategic objectives serve legitimate interests rather than mere personal advancement. This doesn't mean avoiding self-interest, but aligning personal goals with outcomes that benefit others as well. When people believe your success serves their interests too, they become willing partners rather than reluctant subordinates. The second pillar is integrity in methods, using means that maintain respect for human dignity, even while pursuing competitive advantage. I discovered that ethical behavior created predictability and trust that actually enhanced strategic effectiveness. Allies who trusted my word could coordinate more effectively, while enemies who respected my honor sometimes chose negotiation over warfare. The third pillar is wisdom in consequences, considering long-term effects of strategic choices on all stakeholders, not just immediate tactical outcomes. Strategies that achieved short-term objectives while creating long-term problems ultimately failed, while approaches that built sustainable advantage through ethical means created compound benefits. Over time, one campaign illustrates how moral authority multiplied strategic power. Facing an enemy who had gained territory through treachery and brutality, I emphasized the contrast between his methods and mine. Instead of simply opposing his forces, I offered protection to populations he had oppressed and demonstrated through actions that my victory would bring justice rather than merely different oppression. This moral positioning attracted allies, intelligence sources, and popular support that transformed the strategic balance completely. However, moral strategy required understanding the difference between ethical behavior and naive idealism. I maintained clear moral principles while adapting tactics to circumstances, understanding that sometimes difficult decisions served higher ethical purposes. The commander who refused to use deception against enemies seeking genocide would fail in his moral duty to protect innocent lives. The psychological dimension of moral leadership proved as important as its practical benefits. Leaders who operated from clear ethical principles made decisions with confidence and consistency that inspired trust in subordinates. People followed moral leaders through difficult circumstances because they believed in the ultimate worthiness of the cause and the integrity of the leadership. I learned that moral authority must be earned through consistent action rather than declared through noble words. Ethical leadership required daily choices that demonstrated commitment to stated principles, especially when those choices involved personal cost or tactical disadvantage. The leader whose actions consistently matched his values developed credibility that became its own form of strategic power. The most sophisticated application of moral strategy involved using ethical behavior as a competitive advantage against less scrupulous opponents. When enemies relied on treachery, brutality, or deception, my consistent ethical approach created contrast that attracted their potential allies to my cause. My reputation for integrity became a weapon that undermined their ability to build coalitions or maintain loyalty. Yet moral strategy never required being passive or defenseless. I learned to be harmless as a dove and wise as a serpent, maintaining ethical principles while using all legitimate means to achieve righteous objectives. Moral leadership demanded both the wisdom to choose worthy goals and the strategic skill to achieve them effectively. The long-term benefits of moral strategy far exceeded short-term costs. Ethical behavior created reputation that opened doors, built relationships that provided ongoing advantage, and established precedents that created favorable conditions for future endeavors. Leaders known for integrity faced less resistance, attracted better allies, and built more sustainable success than those who relied purely on tactical cleverness. In modern applications, this principle transforms how we approach business ethics, professional relationships, and personal conduct. The executive who builds strategy on ethical foundations often discovers that moral authority creates competitive advantages that purely tactical approaches cannot achieve. The professional who maintains integrity while pursuing advancement finds that ethical behavior opens more doors than it closes. My virtue tablets remind us that in a world where trust is scarce and cynicism is common, moral authority becomes a differentiating advantage that multiplies the effectiveness of every other strategic capability. The worn teaching stones that trained countless officers in strategic thinking carry the weight of my greatest responsibility, ensuring that hard-won wisdom survives beyond any single campaign or commander. These masters' teaching stones represent my discovery that developing other strategic minds multiplies your influence far beyond what individual brilliance can achieve, creating legacy that transforms temporary advantage into enduring impact. Commitment to developing future strategists began with a sobering realization. Even the most successful commander eventually faces limitations of time, energy, and mortality. The strategies that served me perfectly could not be everywhere and once, and my personal knowledge would die with me unless I found ways to transfer it to others. I learned that the ultimate strategic victory is not winning battles, but creating the capability for others to win their own battles using sound principles. The challenge lay in distinguishing between tactical knowledge that could be memorized and strategic wisdom that must be internalized through experience and reflection. Most military training focused on procedures, formations, and techniques, important skills, but insufficient for developing the judgment required for independent, strategic thinking. I needed methods that would cultivate not just competent followers, but future leaders capable of adapting principles to new circumstances. I developed what I called the 4 stages of strategic development, each building upon the previous 2. Create complete strategic thinkers. The first stage was pattern recognition, teaching students to identify recurring strategic situations and understand why certain approaches succeeded or failed. Using historical examples and case studies, I helped them see beyond surface events to underlying strategic dynamics. The second stage was principle extraction, learning to distill universal truths from specific situations. Students practiced analyzing various conflicts to identify the fundamental principles that determined outcomes, regardless of particular circumstances. This stage required moving from memorizing what happened to understanding why it happened, and how similar principles might apply in different contexts. The third stage was adaptive application, developing the ability to modify proven principles for new situations while maintaining their essential effectiveness. I created exercises that presented students with scenarios requiring creative application of strategic concepts, forcing them to think independently, rather than simply following prescribed procedures. The fourth stage was independent innovation, the EOA capacity to develop new strategic approaches when existing methods proved insufficient. This stage could only be achieved through combining thorough grounding in proven principles with the confidence and creativity to transcend them when circumstances demanded original thinking. The teaching methods I developed emphasized experiential learning over passive instruction. Rather than lecturing about strategy, I created simulation exercises that allowed students to experience strategic decision-making under pressure. These exercises revealed not just intellectual understanding, but emotional and psychological readiness for actual strategic responsibility. One of my most successful students demonstrates the power of this approach. Initially showing only average tactical ability, he excelled once he grasped the underlying principles of strategic thinking. Years later, Facing a completely different type of conflict than any we had studied together, he applied the fundamental concepts creatively to achieve victory that surpassed even my own achievements. His success proved that properly developed strategic thinking could adapt to any circumstance. The mentoring relationship required balancing guidance with independence. Too much direction created dependent followers who could not function without supervision. Too little guidance left students to repeat mistakes that proper instruction could have prevented. I learned to provide framework and feedback while encouraging students to develop their own strategic intuition and decision-making. Confidence. I also discovered that the best strategic teachers continue learning from their students. Each new strategic mind brought fresh perspectives that challenged my own assumptions and revealed new applications for established principles. The teaching relationship became mutual development that enhanced both teacher and student capabilities. The selection of students for strategic development required careful consideration. Technical competence was necessary but insufficient. Strategic thinking demanded intellectual flexibility, emotional maturity, and moral character that could be developed but not created from nothing. I looked for individuals who showed curiosity about underlying causes, ability to see patterns across different situations, and commitment to principles larger than personal advancement. The most rewarding aspect of developing strategic thinkers was watching them surpass their teachers' achievements by applying proven principles to new challenges with fresh creativity. Their successes became extensions of the original strategic insights, multiplying impact across time and geography in ways that individual achievement could never accomplish. The responsibility of teaching strategy extends beyond technical knowledge to include ethical development. Strategic capability without moral foundation creates dangerous individuals who might use sophisticated methods for destructive purposes. I emphasize that true strategic mastery serves worthy objectives and maintains respect for human dignity, even while pursuing competitive advantage. In modern applications, this principle applies to leadership development, mentoring, and knowledge transfer in any field. The executive who develops strategic thinking in subordinates multiplies organizational capability far beyond personal contribution. The professional who mentors others creates networks of influence that extend individual impact. The individual who teaches principles rather than just procedures creates lasting value that survives changing circumstances. My teaching stones remind us that the greatest strategic victory is not achieving personal success, but creating the capability for others to achieve their own success using wisdom that transcends individual limitations and circumstances. The eternal victory scroll that lies before me, unmarked by time's passage, represents the most important truth I can share with you. Strategic mastery is not a destination to reach, but a path to walk with increasing wisdom and effectiveness throughout your life. This timeless document reminds us that the principles of winning before fighting remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago, waiting for those with courage to apply them. Everything I have shared with you, from knowing yourself and your opposition through positioning and timing to psychological mastery and ethical leadership, forms an integrated system that transforms how you approach every challenge. These are not separate techniques to apply occasionally, but interconnected principles that become part of how you see and interact with the world. Begin your strategic journey by implementing what I call the daily strategic practice. Each morning, spend a few minutes applying the 4 mirrors of self-knowledge. Examine your emotional state, assess your current capabilities, identify your biases, and evaluate your energy levels. This daily discipline builds the self-awareness that underlies all strategic effectiveness. Throughout the day, practice reading situations through strategic eyes, asking yourself, what is the real challenge here? What are my options for positioning? What would my opposition expect me to do? How can I achieve my objective with minimal resistance? The path to strategic mastery requires patience with the process while maintaining urgency about results. Like water carving through stone, strategic thinking develops through consistent application over time rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Each situation where you choose strategic response over reactive behavior strengthens your strategic instincts. For future challenges, start with smaller situations where the stakes are manageable. Practice strategic positioning in team meetings. Apply psychological insights in negotiations. Use timing principles in career decisions, and employ alliance-building skills in professional relationships. These everyday applications build the confidence and competence needed for larger strategic challenges. Remember that strategic thinking serves not just competitive advantage, but personal fulfillment and ethical leadership. The same principles that win battles can build successful businesses, create thriving relationships, and develop meaningful careers. Strategic mastery ultimately means living with intention, wisdom, and effectiveness, rather than merely reacting to circumstances. The greatest strategic battles you will fight are not against external enemies, but against internal obstacles: fear that prevents bold action, impatience that destroys careful positioning, ego that corrupts clear thinking, and doubt that undermines confidence. Victory over these internal enemies creates the foundation for all external success. As you develop strategic capability, remember the responsibility that comes with this knowledge. Use these principles to create value for others, not just advantage for yourself. Build alliances based on mutual benefit. Apply psychological insights to understand and serve others better, and employ your strategic skills to solve problems that matter. The world needs strategic thinkers who combine effectiveness with ethics, who can see clearly through complexity while maintaining compassion for others. Your development of strategic mastery serves not just personal success, but contributes to solutions for the challenges facing your community, organization, and society. 25 centuries have passed since I first recorded these principles. Yet human nature and the fundamentals of strategic interaction remain unchanged. The same wisdom that guided ancient commanders can guide today's leaders, entrepreneurs, professionals, and individuals seeking to create meaningful impact in their chosen fields. The journey of strategic mastery never ends. There are always new situations to understand, fresh challenges to meet, and deeper levels of wisdom to attain. Each victory teaches lessons for future battles. Each setback provides insights for better preparation, and each relationship offers opportunities to practice alliance building and psychological understanding. Take the first step today. Choose one principle from our time together and apply it to a current challenge in your life. Notice how strategic thinking changes not just your actions, but your entire approach to the situation. Build on that success by gradually incorporating more strategic elements into your daily decisions and long-term planning. The ancient scroll reminds us that victory belongs not to the strongest or fastest, but to those who understand the deeper patterns of competition and cooperation that shape all human endeavors. You now possess the same strategic principles that have guided successful leaders throughout history. The question is not whether these principles work. Their effectiveness has been proven across millennia and cultures. The question is whether you will have the wisdom to apply them and the persistence to master them. Begin today. Your strategic journey awaits, and the world needs what you can accomplish when you learn to win every battle before it starts.